The morning light filtered through the tall windows of the hospital, casting a soft glow on the polished floors. Charlotte walked down the main corridor, her steps steady but slow, as if each one carried the weight of memories too heavy to leave behind. The familiar scent of antiseptic, mixed with the distant hum of machines, greeted her like an old friend. Yet today it felt different, tinged with the ghosts of her past. She hadn't been here in months. The hospital, once a place of solace and purpose, had become a shadowy reminder of what she had lost. Her husband, Mark, and their little boy, Thomas, were gone, taken in a blink during what was supposed to be a joyful family outing. The car crash had been sudden, brutal, leaving her the sole survivor in a world that suddenly felt too big, too empty. For weeks, she had been trapped in a whirlwind of grief, replaying that day over and over again. The sound of shattering glass, the screech of tires, the silence that followed, the silence that still echoed in her heart. She had isolated herself, shutting out the world, cocooned in her sorrow. But even in the deepest pits of her despair, there was something that pulled at her, something that whispered through the fog of her pain. The hospital, her work, the place where she had always felt most alive, most herself. Returning to this place was not easy. It took every ounce of strength she had left to walk through those doors again, to face the well-meaning yet pitying looks of her colleagues, to pretend that she could ever be the same woman she was before. But she had made a decision, somewhere in the quiet hours of the night when the weight of her loss was heaviest. She would not let this grief consume her. She would not let the darkness win. She had to find a way to keep moving, to find meaning in the midst of her pain. As she walked, the familiar rhythm of the hospital began to seep into her bones, soothing her raw nerves. Nurses bustled about, doctors conferred in hushed tones, and the steady beeping of heart monitors filled the air. It was as if the hospital itself was reminding her of why she was here, why she had always been here, to help, to heal, to make a difference in the lives of others, even when her own life felt like it was falling apart. "Charlotte, you're back," Judith, a younger nurse, approached with a bright smile, though her eyes betrayed a hint of concern. "It's so good to see you." Charlotte managed a small smile in return. "It's good to be back," she replied, her voice steady but lacking the usual warmth. "How's everything been?" Judith hesitated for a moment, her gaze searching Charlotte's face. "We've managed, but it hasn't been the same without you. We've missed you." Charlotte nodded, appreciating the sentiment, but unsure of how to respond. She had never been one for idle pleasantries, and now, more than ever, they felt like a foreign language. Instead, she turned her attention to the hallway ahead, her eyes scanning the rooms, the patients, the familiar faces she had once known so well. Everything looked the same, yet nothing felt the same. She stopped in front of room 112, a place she had visited countless times before. Inside, an elderly man lay in bed, his frail body barely a shadow of what it once was. George had been one of her regulars, a grumpy old soul with a heart condition that kept him coming back to the hospital more often than he liked. But despite his cantankerous nature, Charlotte had always had a soft spot for him. "George?" she called softly as she entered the room. The old man's eyes flickered open, and a slow smile spread across his face. "Well, well, look who's decided to grace us with her presence," he rasped, his voice rough but laced with affection. "They said you were on some fancy vacation, but I knew better. Knew you wouldn't stay away for long." Charlotte chuckled, the sound surprising her with its lightness. "You know me too well," she said, moving to check his vitals. "How have you been holding up?" "Oh, you know," he waved a frail hand dismissively. "Jessica's been looking after me, but she's got no sense of humor. Not like you, anyway. Charlotte's smile faded slightly as she adjusted his IV. I'm sorry I wasn't here, George. I needed some time. He nodded, his expression softening. I know, lass. We all need time sometimes. But I'm glad you're back. She met his gaze, and for a moment they simply looked at each other, an understanding passing between them. Charlotte had lost so much, but in this room, in this moment, she felt a glimmer of what she had come back for. To be here, to care, to connect, to heal others, even if she couldn't yet heal herself. The sharp ring of the emergency line cut through the hum of the hospital, snapping Charlotte out of her quiet thoughts. Her hand instinctively reached for the phone, and the voice on the other end was clipped, urgent. Charlotte, we need you in maternity. Now. There was no need for further explanation. Charlotte's pulse quickened as she set the phone down, her feet already moving. The hospital had its share of emergencies, but there was a particular tension that hung in the air whenever the maternity ward called for backup. Lives were always at stake, and not just one, but often two, sometimes more. As she hurried down the corridor, Charlotte's mind raced through the possible scenarios. She had seen it all before. Complications in delivery, mothers barely clinging to life, babies born too early, too fragile. But nothing could have prepared her for what awaited behind those doors. When she pushed into the room, the scene was chaotic. Nurses hovered anxiously around a frail woman on the delivery bed, her face contorted in pain, her breaths shallow and labored. The woman's clothes were tattered, stained with the grime of the streets. Her eyes, hollow and bloodshot, flickered with panic as she clutched the sides of the bed, her body convulsing with each wave of pain. She's a junkie, one of the doctors muttered under his breath, his tone laced with disdain. There's no telling what she's been using. The words were met with a murmur of agreement from a few of the staff, their expressions a mix of wariness and discomfort. The woman was clearly in a dire state, but the underlying question hung in the air. Was she worth the risk? Charlotte's gaze shifted from the woman to the medical staff, catching the uncertain glances being exchanged. The room was tense, the decision weighing heavily on everyone present. Charlotte could feel the conflict bubbling just beneath the surface, the unspoken judgment. We can't risk it. Another nurse spoke up, her voice trembling slightly. She could have anything in her system. We need to protect ourselves, the other patients. Charlotte's stomach churned at the thought. She had always known that the world could be cruel, but it was moments like these that laid it bare. The woman on the bed, struggling to bring life into the world, was being reduced to her worst decisions, her most unfortunate circumstances. No. Charlotte's voice cut through the room with a firmness that surprised even her. The nurses turned to her, their eyes wide with a mixture of relief and apprehension. We are here to save lives, all lives. That includes hers and those of her children. The room fell into a heavy silence. Charlotte took a step forward, positioning herself closer to the woman, whose labored breathing filled the quiet. She looked around the room, meeting each gaze in turn, her resolve unshaken. I understand the risks, she continued, her tone calm but unyielding. But those babies in her womb, they haven't done anything wrong. They don't deserve to be condemned because of their mother's mistakes. The doctor, who had spoken first, hesitated, his brow furrowing in thought. It was clear that he wasn't convinced, but he also wasn't prepared to argue against Charlotte's conviction. After what felt like an eternity, he sighed and gave a curt nod. Fine, he said, his voice lacking enthusiasm but carrying the weight of the decision. But we need to be cautious. Charlotte nodded in agreement, feeling a rush of determination surge through her. She knew this was only the beginning. The real challenge lay ahead. The woman's condition was precarious, and every second counted. She reached out, gently placing her hand on the woman's arm, hoping to convey some sense of comfort through the touch. "We're going to take care of you," Charlotte said softly, her voice steady despite the tumult around her. The woman's eyes fluttered open, meeting Charlotte's for a brief moment, and in that glance, Charlotte saw a flicker of something: fear, desperation, maybe even hope. The woman's body tensed as another contraction hit, and Charlotte could see the toll it was taking. She didn't have much time. The room came alive with activity as the team moved into action, following Charlotte's lead. It was as if her determination had sparked a chain reaction, shifting the atmosphere from one of hesitation to one of purpose. The doctors and nurses worked quickly, efficiently, but there was still an underlying tension. They were battling not just the physical complications, but the weight of the judgment that had lingered in the room moments before. As the minutes ticked by, Charlotte stayed by the woman's side, offering words of encouragement, her voice a steady anchor amidst the storm. The room was thick with tension. Every breath drawn felt like an invasion in the heavy air. The only sounds were the sharp, ragged breaths of the woman on the bed and the urgent whispers of the medical staff. Charlotte stood by the woman's side, her hand a steady anchor on the woman's trembling arm, feeling the tremors of pain that shook her fragile body. The woman's cries echoed through the small space, raw and primal, a sound born of a pain that was more than physical. It was the pain of desperation, of fear, and of a life lived too close to the edge. Her body was gaunt, her face slick with sweat, eyes wide and wild with agony. "Push! You need to push!" the doctor urged, his voice tense but controlled. They had been at this for hours, and the woman was fading fast. Every contraction racked her thin frame. Every push drained what little strength she had left. Charlotte leaned in closer, her voice a gentle contrast to the urgency around her. "You can do this. Just a little more, and your baby will be here." The woman's eyes flickered towards Charlotte, a flash of recognition, maybe even trust, before another wave of pain pulled her under. She gasped, her fingers curling into the sheets, the veins in her neck standing out as she fought against her own exhaustion. "Here we go." The doctor's voice broke through the tension as the baby's head finally crowned. The nurse by his side readied a towel, her face a mask of focus. The room seemed to hold its breath as the doctor guided the tiny form into the world, a thin wail piercing the air as the baby took its first breath. "It's a boy," the doctor announced, relief washing over his features as he handed the newborn to the nurse. The baby's cries filled the room, strong and insistent, a hopeful sound in the midst of the struggle. But the mother, she was barely aware. The momentary relief that swept through the room was short-lived. Her body, already weakened, convulsed with a new, intense pain. She let out a strangled cry, her hand clutching at Charlotte's as if she were drowning, as if Charlotte were the only thing tethering her to this world. "She's still in labor," one of the nurses said, her voice tinged with alarm. The doctor's expression darkened as he quickly moved back to the foot of the bed. Charlotte felt the woman's grip tighten, a desperate plea in that small gesture. "It's not over yet," she whispered, more to herself than to anyone else. "You have to keep going." The doctor's brow furrowed as he examined her. "She's carrying twins," he said, the realization dawning on everyone at once. The room, already tense, became an even tighter knot of anxiety. The woman didn't have much left in her, it was clear to everyone. But there was no time for hesitation. The second baby had to come, and it had to come quickly. "Get ready," the doctor ordered, his voice steadier now, though the urgency was unmistakable. The team moved with practiced precision, but there was a quiet, shared fear that this time their best might not be enough. Charlotte stayed close, her hand never leaving the woman's. She could feel the woman's life slipping away with each passing minute, but she kept her voice calm, reassuring. "Just a little longer," she murmured. "You're almost there." The woman's breathing was shallow, her face pale, lips tinged with blue. Every push was weaker than the last, her body trembling with the effort. Charlotte could see the doctor's concern growing, his movements becoming more urgent. "Come on," he muttered under his breath, his focus narrowing to the task at hand. The room was a blur of movement and sound, but Charlotte felt it all slow, her attention locked on the woman's face, the way her eyes fluttered, half-closed, as if she were drifting away. "Stay with us," Charlotte urged softly, squeezing the woman's hand. "You have to stay with us." "Another one's coming," the doctor said, his voice tight with urgency. He glanced up at Charlotte, his eyes betraying the fear that this time they might not be enough. "She's got to push now, or we'll lose them both." Charlotte nodded, leaning in close to the woman's ear. "You're almost there," she whispered, her voice a lifeline in the chaos. "Just one more push. You can do this." The woman's response was a low moan, a sound filled with so much pain that it was almost unbearable to hear. Her body was shaking uncontrollably, every muscle straining against the force of labor. Sweat beaded on her forehead, her chest rising and falling rapidly as she gasped for air. "Push!" the doctor urged, his voice rising with the tension in the room. The team around him moved in a blur, hands reaching, instruments clattering, all focused on the fragile life that was still waiting to be born. The woman's scream tore through the air as she bore down one final time, her body convulsing with the effort. Charlotte held her breath, the world narrowing to this one moment, this one push. The second baby slid into the doctor's waiting hands, a small, delicate girl, her cries weak but insistent. For a brief, glorious second there was silence, a silence filled with the sound of a tiny heartbeat, a mother's final breath, and the realization that this battle was far from over. "Something's wrong," the nurse closest to the bed whispered, her voice barely audible over the beeping monitors. The woman's body, so tense and strained moments before, now lay frighteningly still, her skin an alarming shade of grey. "She's seizing," the doctor barked, his calm demeanor cracking as he leapt into action. "Get the crash cart in here, now!" Charlotte's heart pounded in her chest as she watched the scene unfold. The woman's body jerked violently, her hand slipping from Charlotte's grasp. The monitor's frantic alarms filled the room, each beep a countdown that seemed to accelerate with every passing second. "Come on, stay with us," the doctor muttered under his breath, his hands moving quickly as he fought to stabilize the mother. But it was clear to everyone in the room that she was slipping away, that the life they had fought so hard to preserve was draining from her with every beat of her faltering heart. Charlotte felt a wave of helplessness wash over her, the kind that she had come to know too well in her years of nursing. It was a feeling that settled in the pit of her stomach, cold and unforgiving, as she realized that they were losing this battle. "Adrenaline now!" the doctor ordered, his voice sharp with desperation. The nurse scrambled to comply, but even as the needle pierced the woman's skin, there was a sense of inevitability that hung in the air, a knowledge that sometimes, no matter how hard you fight, you cannot win. Charlotte reached out once more, her hand trembling as she touched the woman's cooling skin. "Your babies need you," she whispered, her voice breaking with the weight of those words. "Please, fight." but the woman's body only convulsed more violently, her eyes rolling back as the seizures intensified. The doctor barked more orders, the team moving with an urgency that bordered on panic, but the color continued to drain from the woman's face, her breath growing more and more shallow until it was almost imperceptible. "Stay with us," Charlotte pleaded, tears welling in her eyes as she leaned closer, her voice trembling. "Don't leave them." The woman's body suddenly went still, her chest rising in one final shuddering breath before it fell silent. The monitors let out a long, piercing beep, the sound of a life slipping away. In the stillness that followed, the cries of the newborn twins filled the room, a haunting reminder of what had been lost. The doctor stepped back, his hands falling to his sides in resignation, the fight draining from him as he looked to Charlotte, his eyes filled with the sorrow that only comes when the inevitable becomes reality. The sterile white walls of the ICU reflected the harsh fluorescent lights, casting a pallid glow over everything in the room. Machines hummed and beeped in a steady rhythm, a cold, mechanical reminder of the fragile life they were trying to sustain. The mother lay motionless on the bed, her chest barely rising beneath the thin hospital gown. Tubes snaked from her body to various monitors, each one a lifeline in the tenuous battle she was waging. Charlotte stood by the bedside, her eyes fixed on the woman's pale face. The vibrancy that had been there just hours ago, however faint, was now all but gone. Her skin had a waxy hue, her lips tinged with blue, as if the life was slowly ebbing from her body. But Charlotte refused to believe that this was the end. She couldn't let it be. "She's still hanging on," one of the nurses murmured as she checked the readings on the monitor. The tone in her voice suggested more doubt than hope. "Barely," the doctor muttered, not bothering to disguise his skepticism. He sighed, scribbling something on the chart. "She's in critical condition. There's not much more we can do. It's up to her now." Charlotte clenched her jaw, pushing down the wave of frustration that threatened to break through her calm exterior. She had seen this before. Too many times, in fact. The point where medicine could do no more, where it all came down to the sheer will to live. But how could she expect this woman, this stranger who had already suffered so much, to find the strength to keep fighting? "You can't give up now," Charlotte whispered, leaning closer to the unconscious woman. "Not when you've come this far." The monitors continued their monotonous beep, indifferent to her words. But Charlotte wasn't deterred. She took the woman's hand in her own, feeling the coldness of her skin, the slackness of her fingers. She tightened her grip, hoping that somehow some part of the woman could feel her, could hear her. "Your babies need you," she said softly, her voice filled with a quiet intensity. "They need their mother. You brought them into this world, and they're waiting for you. They need you to fight, just a little bit longer." Charlotte's words hung in the air, unanswered. The machines continued their steady work, but the woman lay unresponsive, her body so still it was almost impossible to tell if she was even breathing. Charlotte's heart ached with the weight of it all, the unbearable closeness of life and death, intertwined in this one moment. She glanced at the small window in the door, through which she could see the nursery where the twins were being kept. They were so tiny, so vulnerable, their lives barely begun, and yet they had already lost so much. Charlotte couldn't let them lose their mother too. "Please," she whispered again, her voice cracking with emotion. "They need you. You can't leave them alone in this world." The woman's fingers twitched ever so slightly, a faint, almost imperceptible movement. Charlotte's breath caught in her throat, her heart leaping at the small sign of life. She leaned in closer, her grip on the woman's hand tightening. "That's it," Charlotte urged, her voice barely above a whisper. "Keep fighting. Stay with us. Stay with them." For a moment, it seemed as if the woman might respond, as if the connection between them had sparked something deep within her. But then the monitors beeped erratically, and Charlotte's hope wavered. The doctor was at her side in an instant, barking orders to the nurses as they scrambled to stabilize the patient. Come on," Charlotte muttered under her breath, her eyes never leaving the woman's face. She could feel the desperation clawing at her, the fear that they were losing her for good. But then, as suddenly as it had started, the monitor's beeping steadied, the lines on the screen evening out. The doctor exhaled slowly, relief momentarily easing the tension in his features. The doctor gave her a brief, inscrutable look before turning back to the chart. Charlotte remained by the bedside, her hand still holding the woman's, her own strength now serving as a lifeline. She knew the road ahead would be long and uncertain, but she wasn't about to let go. Not now. Not ever. "Keep fighting," she whispered one last time, her voice filled with a hope she refused to let die. "We're not giving up on you, so don't give up on us." The ICU was enveloped in a heavy silence, broken only by the relentless beeping of machines. Charlotte stood vigil by Lisa's bedside, her eyes locked on the woman whose life was slipping away with every shallow breath. The light in the room was dim, casting long shadows that seemed to mirror the despair settling over Charlotte's heart. The twins were in the nursery, fragile and unaware, but their presence was a constant pull on Charlotte's mind. The thought of them growing up without their mother, of their lives beginning with such a profound loss, was unbearable. She had to do something, anything, to give Lisa one last chance to connect with her children. A sudden thought gripped her, irrational perhaps, but it was the only hope she had left. Without a second thought, she turned on her heel and hurried toward the nursery. The corridor seemed longer than ever, each step echoing her urgency and desperation. When she reached the nursery, the sight of the twins, so small, so innocent, made her heart ache. They were bundled tightly in their blankets, eyes closed, oblivious to the turmoil in the world they had just entered. Charlotte gently lifted them, one in each arm, and carried them back to Lisa's room. Her entrance into the ICU drew puzzled glances from the staff, but no one stopped her. They had seen the futility in the battle to save Lisa, and perhaps they too were willing to grasp at any sliver of hope. Charlotte moved with purpose, her steps steady despite the weight of the task she had set for herself. "Charlotte, what are you—" one of the doctors began, his voice laced with confusion. "Just let me try," Charlotte interrupted, her tone leaving no room for argument. She approached the bed, her gaze softening as she looked down at Lisa's still form. Gently she placed each baby on either side of Lisa, their tiny bodies nestled against their mothers. The monitors beeped in a steady rhythm, a counterpoint to the silence that had fallen over the room. Charlotte held her breath, her hands hovering protectively over the infants, as if her presence alone could make this work. "Come on, Lisa," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "Your babies are here. They need you. Just one more moment with them, please." For a few agonizing seconds, nothing happened. The room was tense, the staff frozen in place, all eyes on the still figure in the bed. Charlotte's heart pounded in her chest, a drumbeat of hope and fear intertwined. She could feel the coolness of Lisa's skin through the thin sheets, the life within her hanging by the thinnest of threads. And then, impossibly, the monitors began to change. A weak, irregular beep cut through the air, followed by another. Charlotte's breath caught as she saw the faintest flicker of movement in Lisa's eyelids. The room seemed to hold its collective breath, the atmosphere charged with a mixture of disbelief and awe. Lisa's eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first, then slowly settling on the faces of her newborns. Her gaze was filled with a deep, unfathomable love, as if the sight of them had called her back from the brink. A tear slid down her cheek, and her lips moved, forming words too faint to hear. Charlotte leaned in close, her heart pounding in her ears. "Lisa, can you hear me?" The response was barely more than a whisper, but it was there. "Take care of them," Lisa managed, her voice weak but filled with a desperate plea. Her eyes met Charlotte's, and in that moment, a silent understanding passed between them. "I will," Charlotte promised, her voice breaking. "I'll take care of them. I swear it." Lisa's hand twitched, her fingers brushing against one of the baby's cheeks. The brief contact seemed to exhaust what little strength she had left. Her eyes fluttered closed again, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The monitors beeped frantically, the rhythm growing erratic once more. But this time, there was no turning back. The momentary miracle was fading, the connection that had briefly tethered her to life slipping away. Charlotte watched helplessly as the light dimmed from Lisa's face, her body going still once more. The monitors emitted a long, flat tone, the final note in a song of life, cut short. Tears blurred Charlotte's vision, but she didn't look away. She cradled the babies close, their small warmth a stark contrast to the coldness that now settled over the room. The miracle had been brief, but it was real. In those final moments, Lisa had found the strength to return, to see her children, to say goodbye. And Charlotte knew that somehow that fleeting connection would be enough to carry them all forward. As the staff quietly exited the room, Charlotte remained holding the twins close, her heart heavy with grief, but filled with a new resolve. She had made a promise she intended to keep. The hospital corridors buzzed with a quiet hum, punctuated by soft murmurs and the occasional clatter of a cart being wheeled down the hall. But on this particular day, there was an undercurrent of something different, something that lingered in the air like the remnants of a powerful storm. It was the story, the miracle of Lisa, that had taken root in every corner of the hospital, spreading from one room to the next, whispered by nurses during shift changes, passed along by doctors in hushed conversations. Charlotte had never seen anything like it. She had witnessed miracles before, tiny victories snatched from the jaws of death, but nothing that had sparked such a palpable sense of wonder. And it wasn't just the fact that Lisa had briefly returned from the brink to say goodbye to her children. It was what that moment represented, the unbreakable bond between mother and child, the raw, unfiltered power of love. As Charlotte moved through the hospital, she could feel the eyes of her colleagues on her, their expressions a mix of admiration and something deeper, something akin to reverence. They didn't ask questions. They didn't need to. The story had been told and retold so many times that it had taken on a life of its own, growing into something larger than any of them. It was on everyone's lips, in every whispered conversation, how a dying woman had defied all odds, how she had clung to life long enough to see her babies, how she had passed on not in despair, but in the peace of knowing her children would be cared for. There was something deeply human in that story, something that touched everyone who heard it. And Charlotte felt the weight of it pressing down on her. She paused outside the nursery, her hand hovering over the door handle. Inside, the twins slept soundly, oblivious to the whirlwind their brief lives had already caused. For a moment, Charlotte hesitated, the enormity of what she was considering nearly overwhelming. She had made a promise to Lisa, but this was something else entirely. This was stepping into a role she had lost long ago, a role she had never thought she would fill again. The door clicked softly as she pushed it open, and the sterile scent of the nursery greeted her, mingling with the faint, comforting smell of baby powder. She moved quietly to the cribs where the twins lay, their tiny chests rising and falling in perfect unison. They were so small, so fragile, yet they had already survived so much. Charlotte reached out, her fingers brushing the edge of the blanket that covered the little girl. The touch was light, almost hesitant, as if she were afraid that anything more might shatter the delicate moment. As she stood there, watching over them, she felt something shift inside her, a stirring that she hadn't felt in years. It was a connection, one that reached deep into the past, to a time when she had held her own child in her arms, when her world had revolved around the small, precious life she had brought into the world. The pain of that loss had never truly left her, but now, standing here, it felt different. It felt like a wound that had been reopened, but in a way that allowed it to finally heal. "They're beautiful, aren't they?" Charlotte turned at the soft voice, finding one of the nurses standing in the doorway. The nurse's eyes were kind, filled with a knowing that only someone who had heard the story could possess. "They are," Charlotte replied, her voice barely above a whisper. She glanced back at the twins, her heart swelling with a mixture of emotions she couldn't quite name. "I promised their mother I'd take care of them." The nurse nodded, stepping closer. "You'd be giving them a gift, Charlotte, a real chance at life." Charlotte felt the truth of those words settle deep within her. It wasn't just about honoring a promise, it was about something more, something that tied her past to her present in a way that felt both terrifying and right. The thought of taking them in, of becoming a mother again, filled her with a strange, almost forgotten sense of purpose. "I don't know if I'm ready," Charlotte admitted, her gaze fixed on the babies. "I've lost so much already. I don't know if I can—" The nurse placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, offering silent support. "No one's ever ready for something like this. But you've got the strength, Charlotte, and you've got the love." Charlotte closed her eyes, letting the nurse's words wash over her. She thought of Lisa, of the strength it must have taken to hold on for those final moments, to see her children and say goodbye. That kind of love, it was rare and it was powerful, and it was that same love that now connected her to these two innocent lives. When she opened her eyes, the decision had been made, even if she hadn't fully realized it yet. She would take them in. She would give them the love that Lisa had been forced to leave behind. And in doing so, she would heal a part of herself that she had long thought broken beyond repair. Charlotte reached down, gently lifting the little girl from the crib. The baby stirred, her eyes fluttering open briefly before closing again in the comfort of Charlotte's arms. And just like that, the connection was complete, an unspoken bond that filled the room with a warmth that no words could capture. Charlotte sat in the quiet of her small apartment, the weight of the past few days pressing down on her like a heavy fog. The silence was almost suffocating, broken only by the soft breathing of the twins, now sleeping peacefully in the crib she had hastily set up in the corner of her living room. They were tiny, so fragile, and yet they had already survived so much. As she watched them, a deep sense of responsibility settled over her, mingling with the remnants of grief and the stirrings of something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. Hope. The decision had not come easily. When she had first considered taking in the twins, her mind had been a swirl of doubt and fear. She had lost her own son, and the pain of that loss had nearly destroyed her. How could she open herself up to that kind of hurt again? But then she had remembered Lisa's eyes. The desperate plea she had whispered with her final breath. Take care of them. It was more than a promise she had made. It was a duty she couldn't ignore. As the night deepened, Charlotte replayed the conversation she had with the social worker earlier that day. The woman had been kind, understanding the weight of what Charlotte was taking on, but she hadn't minced words. You need to be aware, the social worker had said, her voice firm but gentle. The twins may face significant challenges. Their mother's drug use during pregnancy could have lasting effects, developmental delays, emotional struggles, perhaps even physical issues. This won't be easy. Charlotte had nodded, her heart heavy with the knowledge. She wasn't naive. She had seen the consequences of addiction play out in the lives of too many patients over the years. But this was different. This was personal. I know, Charlotte had replied, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside. But they deserve a chance, and I'll do everything I can to give them that. Now, as she sat alone in the dim light, those words echoed in her mind. Everything she could. She had promised Lisa, and she had promised herself. But the reality of what that meant was only beginning to settle in. There would be sleepless nights, moments of frustration, times when she would doubt her ability to do this. And yet, as she looked at the sleeping babies, she knew that this was the right choice, the only choice. The first few days were a blur of diapers, feedings, and endless worry. The twins were healthy enough, but Charlotte was acutely aware of the challenges that lay ahead. They were fussy, more so than most newborns, and there were moments when they would cry inconsolably for hours on end. Charlotte's heart ached for them, for the struggles they would face, struggles they had never asked for. One night, as the clock ticked past midnight, Charlotte found herself pacing the small living room, the baby boy cradled against her chest. He had been crying for nearly an hour, his small face scrunched in discomfort, and nothing she did seemed to soothe him. Exhaustion weighed on her, and for a fleeting moment she felt a pang of despair. What if she couldn't do this? What if she wasn't enough? But then she looked down at his tiny face, his eyes squeezed shut in frustration, and something inside her hardened. She had made a promise, and she wouldn't let him down. She wouldn't let either of them down. "You're safe now," she whispered, her voice barely audible over his cries. "I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." Slowly, his cries began to subside, his small body relaxing against her. Charlotte continued to pace, her steps slow and deliberate, until finally he drifted off to sleep. She held him a little longer, letting the rhythm of his breathing calm the storm inside her. This was just the beginning, she knew, but she was ready. She had to be. As the days turned into weeks, Charlotte found herself falling into a routine. It wasn't easy. There were days when the weight of it all seemed too much to bear. The twins had their good days and their bad days, and Charlotte learned to cherish the quiet moments, the small victories. The first time they both slept through the night, the first smile, the way they reached for her with tiny, trusting hands. The sun dipped low on the horizon, casting a warm, golden glow over the small yard where Charlotte sat with the twins. The late summer breeze rustled the leaves of the old oak tree, carrying with it the scent of freshly cut grass and the faint, sweet aroma of blooming flowers. It was a peaceful evening, the kind that had become rare in her life, but one that she had learned to cherish deeply. The twins, now nearly a year old, were crawling clumsily on the blanket spread out beneath the tree. Their laughter filled the air, a sound that never failed to bring a smile to Charlotte's face, no matter how tired she was. It had been a long, difficult year, one filled with sleepless nights, medical appointments, and moments of doubt that had threatened to overwhelm her. But here, in this moment. All of that seemed distant, almost unreal. "Look at you two," Charlotte murmured, watching as the boy reached out to his sister, their small hands brushing as they shared a toy between them. It was a simple gesture, but one that spoke volumes about the bond they had already formed. "You're stronger than you know." It had taken time, more time than she had anticipated, for them to reach this point. The twins had struggled, their early months marked by health scares and developmental delays that had left Charlotte's heart in her throat more times than she cared to remember. There were days when it seemed like the weight of it all might crush her, when the fear that she wasn't enough, that she couldn't do this, threatened to pull her under. But for every challenge there had been a victory, small, sometimes barely noticeable, but victories nonetheless. The first time they held their heads up on their own, the day they started to crawl, the way they smiled at her when she walked into the room. These were the moments that had kept her going, the moments that had reminded her of why she had made this choice. "You're doing great," Charlotte said softly, though the words were as much for herself as they were for the children. She had learned to celebrate the small things, to take joy in the everyday moments that others might overlook. It was in these moments that she found strength, that she realized just how far they had all come. The twins were thriving now, their laughter a testament to the life they had been given, a life that Charlotte had fought so hard to protect. The doctor's warning still echoed in her mind. There would be challenges ahead, difficulties they couldn't foresee. But for now, that didn't matter. What mattered was that they were here, together, a family in every sense of the word. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the yard, Charlotte felt a deep sense of peace settle over her. The fear and uncertainty that had been her constant companions for so long had begun to fade, replaced by a quiet, steady resolve. She had faced the worst that life could throw at her, and she had come out the other side stronger, more certain of who she was and what she was capable of. She reached out, gently scooping the twins into her arms. They nestled against her, their small bodies warm and solid, and she felt a wave of emotion wash over her. Love, yes, but also something deeper, something that spoke to the very core of who she had become. "I've got you," she whispered, pressing a kiss to the top of each of their heads. "We've got each other, and that's all we need." The twins cooed in response, their small hands clutching at her shirt as they settled against her. Charlotte closed her eyes, savoring the moment, the simple joy of holding them close. It was a joy she had thought she might never feel again, a joy she had feared was lost to her forever. But here, in the quiet of the evening, with her children in her arms, she knew that she had found something far greater than she had ever imagined. She had found hope. It wasn't the kind of hope that came with grand gestures or miraculous recoveries. It was the quiet, persistent kind, the kind that grew in the small moments, in the daily victories that added up to something extraordinary. It was the kind of hope that was born of love, of the belief that no matter how hard things got, they could get through it together. And they had. And that, my friends, is a touching story of motherly love, a testament to the enduring strength and sacrifice that defines it. If this story of Charlotte's journey has moved you, take a moment to reflect on the power of love and resilience in our lives. If you found this video meaningful, please give it a thumbs up and share it with someone who might need a little inspiration today. And if you're new to our channel, welcome. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss a story that touches the heart and reminds us of what truly matters. Thank you for watching and being a part of this journey with us. Stay tuned for more stories that resonate deeply, inspire action, and bring us closer together. Until next time, remember to cherish the love in your life and keep spreading kindness. Take care.